Hi there, I'm Baxter Bradford. I'm a photographer, just recently moved from Leamington to Exmouth in Devon. Filters have got a range of different uses. The prime reason that I use them is to control contrast, and so I use neutral density graduated filters in different strengths in order to balance the exposure across the frame. You can also use full neutral density filters in order to increase the length of the exposure in order to get effects with the clouds and water when that's in the scene. I use a digital spot meter which I've had from my film days, and I use that to measure the relative brightness throughout the frame, and then I generally select the filter erring on the side of using less strength than it says to get a complete match, because I think it's important you get a balanced, natural look to your picture. Yeah, I found when I first started using mirrorless cameras with an EVF that there's a disparity between the histogram and the brightness when I looked on the computer and what I was seeing through the viewfinder. And because it's such an intuitive way of shooting using the EVF, by simply just calibrating it, reducing the brightness on my cameras, I just found that gave me the match, and I was then having to do less post-processing. I'm lazy compared to some people. I use aperture priority, and the reason for that is because it gives dynamic metering and makes sort of subtle adjustments without you even knowing, so you can concentrate on the scene, the framing, and actually the timing of your exposure. One thing you do need to be aware of if you're putting a graduated filter down through the scene is that because you're putting a darker object over the frame, the camera will increase the exposure. So if you're trying to protect your highlights, you'll need to apply a compensation with your plus minus button in technical terms in order to darken the image so that you don't lose those highlights. This is something I developed just with a group of people. We were on a beach on a workshop, and we discovered if we put the transition of a neutral density graduated filter halfway down the frame, there was a new rule of thirds. And so if you put a two-stop filter down, the camera meter on aperture priority automatically increased the exposure by 2/3 of a stop. So to compensate for that, you would then decrease the exposure, put it onto minus 2/3. If it was a three-stop filter, 3/3 or a whole stop, and so you'd apply that compensation. Yes, I do stack filters, and I think it's really important that you can have that flexibility. Sometimes you've got very bright foreground, and it's useful to invert a filter and put that up to darken your foreground down. But more commonly where I use it is one over the sky down to the horizon, and that would usually be a hard one-stop grad, sometimes a little bit stronger than that. And then I'll use often a soft transition in another strength down over the rest of the frame to balance it up between a dark foreground and sort of to get the overall frame. That means that by stacking filters you actually need to buy less of them because you're not having to carry one in every single strength. If I'm out in the field, then I use a soft handkerchief or one of the camp towels, which is like a giant lens cloth, to wipe that away. If you've got some fresh water in a water bowl, then that can be useful to remove things. You need to be careful not to scratch them, especially if they're resin filters. And then my other tip, which I have done through experience and I advise no one else to do, is don't use hot water when you're washing your resin filters because it makes them lovely and bendy. You don't always have to put your polarizing filter on before you decide you're going to use it. It's easy just to hold it up to the eye and rotate it to see if it's having an effect, because that is a rough and ready way of doing it. And then the other thing I use quite a lot when I'm shooting coastal scenes with spray in the air is I've got a 3-slot filter holder, and if I'm using one or two stack grads, I'll use those on the innermost ones, and then the third slot is the outermost one, and I'll choose a grad that I'm not going to use, and that just acts as a spray catcher, and so I can set my exposure up, I can wait for clouds to go by or whatever until I'm ready to shoot, pull that filter out really quickly, make my exposure, and then put it back in the holder.